You're listening to the LA Football Podcast.
What's up, Los Angeles? Welcome back to the LA Football Show right here on the LA Football Network. We are live on the mightier 1090 ESPN Radio. If you're back on radio from the break, welcome back. You already know Jamal is out for the day, but this is our Chargers segment. The Bolt fam, loud and proud. What is up? And joining me for this segment is the great Dan Wolkenstein. He does our Chargers Unleashed podcast on the LA Football Network. So all things Chargers, Dan is your guy. You can find him on Twitter at Dan W Sports. My brother, obviously we talk all the time, but how we doing? Welcome back to the show.
Brother from another mother, I am great. Thank you for having me on. Excited to be here. How are you, my friend?
I'm great. Can't complain. It's the off season, a little quicker than we wanted for our Chargers, unfortunately, but the show goes on. Still plenty to talk about. Before we get into it, though, how's that beautiful baby girl of yours? She's getting big.
Baby girl is amazing. She's getting big. Thank you for asking. She's standing. She's saying dad now. So life is good. Life is good. I can't complain. Honestly, it's great. How's your little one?
I feel like she's great. I'll tell you a second, but I feel like we may have talked about this before. I can't remember. Did she say mama first or dada first?
She said dada first, but she has said
Nice.
mama lately. So I only got that for like a couple weeks where it was just me.
There you go. Hey, you'll take what you can get. Take what you can get. My daughter said mama first, which I was devastated, but it was the opposite. lasted like a day, and then it was all dada. So I was like, all right, well, at least she came back strong.
There you go.
But yeah, she's doing good. She turns 3 in a couple months, which is crazy. Talking up a storm. We put her in soccer, so she's all pumped about that and having fun kicking the ball around and all that good stuff. So doing good. Cannot complain. Let's get into it. Our Chargers are deep in offensive coordinator search, as is obviously very important. Joe Lombardi, as everyone knows, let go last week. Brandon Staley retained. Shane Day, QB coach, also let go. So this is probably the most important hire of Brandon Staley's tenure, considering now this is kind of like a make or break year for him in year 3 as the head coach. They've now completed 6 interviews, Dan, for OC, 3 of those coming from the Rams. You got Gerald Johnson, assistant QB coach for the Vikings. You got Steichel from Tennessee, and I think I'm blanking on one. You can throw it in there if you remember.
Zach Robinson is another.
Yeah. So casting the net wide. So let's start with this. Of the candidates they've already interviewed, of those 6, who's kind of your favorite of those 6? And are you pleased with the list, or is it a little underwhelming for you?
Ooh, good question. I'll take the second part of that first. I am pleased with the list, and although I will say, and I want Chargers fans to hear this clearly, it is still incomplete. There are still many coaching candidates who can easily interview for this job who are currently playing this coming weekend in the championship games, both AFC and NFC. So while the list is not complete, if it was ended as is, I think I'd wonder why some of these guys aren't going to be picked, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But I think there are going to be still some names coming out here in the next week or so. And then to answer the first question, who I like the most of the guys they've already interviewed? Thomas Brown and I think Zach Robinson are probably the 2 that I am highest on. I do like Joe Brady as well. I'm sure we'll get into those, but I would probably say Zach Robinson is the one that I'm most keen on, probably followed by Joe Brady. Yeah, Joe Brady, I think, is actually going to be interviewing today, if I remember right.
Yeah, should be coming up, which I know a lot of fans are excited about that one, which I have thoughts on that. I'll get to in a second. But, Zach Robinson is interesting because obviously comes from, the McVay tree and that line of thinking. And he actually went to my rival high school. He was a senior, I believe, when I was a freshman out in Colorado. So a little Colorado kid, I think it was Chatfield High School. But obviously, young mind, passing game coordinator for the Rams. For me personally, I love him with the Rams. I think he has a lot of potential, but with how crucial of a hire this is for Staley, for Herbert, for the future of this franchise, I would be a little worried about a guy that's never called plays taking over your offense to run the show. I think that's a risk that you would have taken 2 years ago, but maybe
for sure.
Yeah, but maybe not now. However, I wouldn't hate it by any means. Thomas Brown, I love. We just talked on our Rams segment, Dan, that to me, Rams, I'm sure you heard, just hired Michael LaFleur as their OC, formerly of the Niners and just previously with the Jets. And for me, it's really mystifying. And this is what we were trying to figure out is like why they wouldn't just promote Thomas Brown to OC. He's been kind of the guy in waiting there and is so beloved and respected with the organization. He was the running back coach for many years, and now they transitioned to tight end and assistant head coach to kind of give him more well-rounded, which made me think he was kind of the OC in waiting or even a potential head coach in waiting. So very strange that the Rams went in to, get LaFleur instead. But for me, that leaves things wide open for the Chargers. Now, I know everything I said about the play calling, and he has also not done play calling, but he's been a lot more tenured. He's had different roles with the Rams in the organization. He's been around through the Jared Goff years with Stafford, with the Super Bowl. So he's been around more. So I'd feel a lot more confident with him taking over that offense. And obviously comes from a running background. And so that's a big thing with this Chargers team is reestablishing the run and getting that going again. But obviously now being with the tight ends can kind of get into that passing background as well. So of the candidates they hired, and I'll toss it back to you, Thomas Brown's definitely my leading candidate. He was before they even started the search. I said Thomas Brown's probably my top 3 of all potential OCs for the Bolts. So that's one I loved. Hopefully it went well.
Yeah, a couple nuggets there. The one thing Thomas Brown does have in terms of feather in his cap over Zach Robinson is he technically does have some offensive play calling experience in the college ranks when he was offensive coordinator and running backs coach for University of Miami. So from 2016 to 2018, he actually did do play calling. Now, not the NFL. I know it's very different, but he at least has some of that. Zach Robinson, it's one of those things for those two guys. I don't honestly, personally, don't know if he can go wrong. I think it's a risk either way. But Zach Robinson, I think the one thing that I believe folks are probably highest on with him is kind of how much he leans into the analytics and kind of the modern NFL, if you will. And kind of looking at his background, comes from PFF. He was actually a director of kind of this quarterback ranch, essentially workshop that he did for prospects coming into the NFL draft. He started his own quarterback academy after he was in the NFL for 4 years as a quarterback for the Patriots and the Seahawks and the Lions and the Bears. And then went through up, I mentioned PFF, then became the quarterbacks coach, wide receiver coach, quarterbacks coach, and then now the passing coordinator. So like he's true, like a quarterback guy. That's what he's done his entire career. And I think leaning into the modern analytics and leaning into kind of the McVay scheme and how Brandon Staley operates, I think that's where so many connections are. And I think if you were to kind of take a poll, I would probably say Zach Robinson might be, I think, the front runner, both from a fan's perspective as well as what it looks like in tea leaves with the front office. That said, we'll get into it. There are other guys who are also very intriguing, who have not yet been announced that they are getting interviewed by the Chargers, but I hope they do. But even if not, Zach Robinson, Thomas Brown, both those guys are great. Joe Brady, though, I will say, like the one thing that he has going for him, he's obviously coached the Bills. He's a quarterback's coach for them now. But looking back, he was an offensive coordinator for the Panthers. Now, say what you will about the Panthers. When you have guys like they had at quarterback, it's hard to be that successful. So you kind of understand it. But before that, he was LSU's passing coordinator and wide receiver coach. And he was coaching the likes of Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, and Justin Jefferson and putting up like 48-point-something points per game and a national championship. So Joe Brady's got experience with some of the great quarterbacks, some of the young great quarterbacks. You talk about Josh Allen now. You talk about Joe Burrow in the past. So all the guys that we've seen so far, those are 3 that I would pick.
So Dan, Joe Brady is an interesting one to me, and I'm definitely not anti Brady, but he's a guy, in my opinion, that obviously we'll see how this interview goes and kind of how the thought process is, because I know Brandon Staley is a very smart guy. Say what you want about him on the sidelines, but I would hope most fans wouldn't disagree with it. The dude knows football, and he's smart and knows kind of analytics and X's and O's, and whether he carries that out on Sundays is a different story, but I think everyone could agree with that. So I'm curious to see how that conversation goes. And if it's 2 kind of gurus just having a great time on the whiteboard and really drawing things up of how Joe Brady can really not necessarily expose, but expedite and expand on Justin Herbert's already talented arm. My only thing with him is he reminds me of those, when you have a quarterback, let's say and this, I don't want this to be misconstrued, but when you have a Nick Foles or a Matt Flynn that kind of has that one monstrous game or season, and then all of a sudden one team throws the bag at him thinking that they're the next big thing, and then you realize well, not necessarily. I'm not saying Joe Brady's that, but Joe Brady essentially had one great season with LSU, which that entire coaching staff got plucked out of that, and none of them have really gone on outside of Dave Aranda and done a lot of successful things. After that, obviously Joe Burrow's had success. The players have had a lot of success, but Joe Brady leaves after one season. We see what happened in Carolina. Did not go well. Now, obviously, can't put all the blame on him. Matt Rule no longer there. Obviously, wasn't running a great operation. They didn't have successful quarterback play. So there's a lot of factors that go into it, which is why I don't think necessarily he's down and out. But he's not a front runner for me yet, just because I haven't seen success. However, at least we've seen something out there as opposed to some of the other guys that we haven't seen anything. We don't know. It's all behind closed doors because they're not the ones running the show. So go ahead.
No, you're not wrong, and I think the undercurrent here is, and you said it earlier, but how important this is for not just Brandon Staley, but like the entire organization, whether it's for their quarterback Justin Herbert now getting ready for his second contract, which may happen this year, whether it's for the ownership, whether it's for the fans in attendance, for the race in the AFC West, for Brandon Staley's career, like so many factors are leading into this, and quite frankly, if Brandon Staley and company mess this up, you can't just leave a franchise quarterback like Justin Herbert essentially simmering and not ever catching on fire. Yeah. And so that's why this hire, the Chargers are casting a wide net. In my eyes, it's a wide net, but a narrow focus. You'll notice a lot of trends with these guys that they're interviewing. One, majority of them are all West Coast, McVay, Shanahan, tree branches off the trunk, if you will. Mm-hmm. Another one, you'll see a lot of folks with emphasis on the running game. So like folks like Thomas Brown, huge in the running game, and or tight end production, which a lot of people see as a need for improvement on this Chargers team, both in talent and in scheme. So lots of things for this coaching staff and front office to take into account. But I said before, I think there are other guys who are going to be brought in who are not yet discussed on the Twitterverse. So look out for folks on the Eagles, folks on the Niners, and folks on the Bengals.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's get into that then. So who are, and if you haven't specifically looked into it, that's fine, but who are some guys that you either think or just want to see them because you like the pedigree they come from?
Yes, good question. So there are probably, I think there are 3 guys out of the 4 teams in the championship weekend that I could see the Chargers going after. 2 of which I think are names you see thrown around a lot on social media and with some of the beat writers that cover this team. One of which not so much, but I hope that they can bring him in. So the 3 guys that I would probably say, Brian Johnson, which is the Eagles
QB
coach. Dan Pitcher, which is the Bengals quarterback coach. And then the dark horse for me is Bobby Slowick, which we'll get into in a bit here. And I preface all of this with I personally believe that the Chargers offensive coaching staff is going to have somewhat of a pretty big overhaul. Mm-hmm. I would not be surprised if more than one of these guys ends up joining in on this coaching staff. I would imagine both probably would have to be promoted. So as you look at some of the resumes, you see what they're doing. One might be promoted to offensive coordinator, and one might be promoted from like a QB coach to like a passing coordinator. Who knows? But I can see more than one of these guys coming in. But Brian Johnson probably would be one from the Eagles quarterbacks coach. You see what he's doing with Jalen Hurts and how incredible that offense is looking. The other one would probably be Dan Pitcher, who comes from the Bengals. And it's kind of interesting with his background. He's been a quarterback's coach. He's been an offensive assistant. He also was a scout back in the day for the Colts. So he kind of understands kind of what's important for folks coming into the league. And then Bobby Slowick, to me, Now, how likely this is, given, generally speaking, I think a lot of guys in the Shanahan system don't really leave the Shanahan system unless it's like a big jump. But this season, he's the passing coordinator for the 49ers. And we all know how fun and how efficient the passing game is for San Francisco. I believe that the two quarterbacks, first Garoppolo was number 1 in passing efficiency before he was hurt, and Brock Purdy is now number 3 in passing efficiency. The fact that Bobby Slowick has this team in the the NFC Championship game with a third-string quarterback, it says all you need to know. But before that, he's been an offensive assistant for the Niners. Then before that, he was defensive quality control. And then before that, he was a defensive assistant at Washington Commanders. Also did a lot of video scouting and competitive play review for coaching staff with the Commanders as well. So he'd look at upcoming teams and their opponents and find trends that they can go ahead and attack. And then obviously also just feathering the cap, he used to be a wide receiver prior to that in college. So he has the pedigree. He has kind of the well-roundedness, and I think that's one of the things that Telesco and that Spanos liked about Brandon Staley is, yes, he's a defensive mind, a defensive guru, but he also was a quarterback, and he has kind of that two-sided approach. I can see them going for something like that for the offensive coordinator position, where they have someone who has experience calling plays, experience framing that side of the ball, but also understands what the other side's doing. So those are 3 guys I have. Slowick is on my top list. I have him as one of my top 3 in total. Again, dark horse, but don't be surprised if you see his name come up.
Yeah. Love Slowick. I assume he will for sure, unless they make a decision beforehand, get interviewed just because he fits the bill and everything you said. I don't need to double down on it. The interesting thing with him and really anyone from this kind of West Coast style, Shanahan, Sean McVay is, and I want to say this correctly, but I know fans want to see Herbert throw the ball 60 yards down the field and stretch the field that way. So if you watch the Niners and even the Rams, they do explosive plays, not necessarily throwing it 70 yards, 60 yards, 50 yards. It's yak. It's getting guys open in space. And so that'll be a focal point and the point. But I don't want anyone to sit here and think, okay, now we're just going to drop it back and sling it like all over the yard. It's going to be very
great
efficient.
Point.
It's still very efficient style, but it's getting explosive plays, which Brandon Staley in his end of year press conference said that very poignantly. Like, you don't have to have a 4.2 speed guy to have explosive plays. You can do it in the run game. You can do it in short yardage passing game, but it's getting guys in space that then create explosive plays. And I think Bobby Slowick can do that. It just doesn't look like many people think. Brian Johnson is one of my top candidates. So I love that you brought him up. For those that don't know, he also was the OC at Florida in the college ranks. So he called plays down there. They had the number 1 passing offense in all of FBS. They had, I think, the 8th total offense in all of FBS and the 7th scoring offense. And that was in the years, I think, Kyle Trask at QB, if I'm not mistaken. So has that offensive coordinator pedigree, called plays, but then now has gotten the NFL pedigree on Sirianni's staff with the Eagles. And obviously you mentioned it, what they've done with Jalen Hurts. So we're up against the time already, Dan, but I want to throw a couple names out that you didn't say that I'm curious your thoughts. And most likely these guys won't get interviews considering they're not in the playoffs and they haven't got them yet. But one guy formerly on the Chargers, Pep Hamilton. Any thoughts on old Pep, who really helped Herbert in his rookie season?
Okay, so I do like this. My co-host and I, so Jake Hefner and I on the show, actually talked about Pep Hamilton a little bit. Former quarterbacks coach for the Chargers with familiarity with Justin Herbert, obviously, and his rookie year balled out largely because of Pep Hamilton. No longer with the team. I think it'd be interesting. I think I share your concern about experience specifically calling plays versus just coaching the quarterbacks. I'm not quite sure how that would go, but I would be intrigued. And that would be another person who I could see coming in as another member of the staff. Maybe not the OC, but some other position that would help kind of increase the brain trust in the team.
Yeah, obviously called plays last year with Houston, did some play calling when he was the head coach and GM of the Defenders in the XFL, did some play calling with Michigan a little bit, split time over there when he was one of the coordinators over there. So has some experience, has other experience doing other things. The thing with me, which is why I don't think it'll happen, is obviously Staley had the opportunity to hire him the first go around and did not. So typically you don't see that happen again, but you never know if, especially depending on who Houston hires, if he is not retained, that could be an option. So, and the last one I will say is one that I don't know if anyone's really thought of, and probably not a guy because he hasn't had a ton of success specifically last year, but Clint Kubiak, formerly he was the Broncos pass game coordinator last year. He was the Vikings offensive coordinator 2 years ago under Mike Zimmer. So he's called plays. We saw it up. The Broncos offense was terrible, but it did improve when he took over some play calling duty last year. And he comes from that same Shanahan Kubiak tree and line of thinking. So just another guy that I'd love to see them at least interview and pick their brain.
That would be an interesting one. I feel like he had two polar opposites in terms of success. 2 years ago with what they did with Justin Jefferson. I mean, it's impressive what that offense looked like with him. And then moving forward this past year with the Broncos and Russell Wilson and the whole crapshoot that happened there. Again, who knows what the real reason is for the offensive woes that the Broncos had, but either way, that is a stain on your resume if you are part of that organization that year.
Yeah, for real. I mean, hey, if Hackett can get another job with the Jets at OC, I think Kubiak can as well. So, we shall see. That's all the time we got for our Chargers segment on the LA Football Show. If you're on radio, we'll be back after the break. If you're on podcast, we'll be back with more Chargers talk, obviously, next week. So, Dan, appreciate it as always, brother. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Have a good one. Enjoy the weekend. Enjoy the drive home.
Yes, sir. Make sure to check out Dan's podcast, Chargers Unleashed, on the LA Football Network. See you all next week.
You're listening to the LA Football Podcast.